2. Freud and the Transcendental Relation. Introductory remarks, Psychopathology and the Unconscious. If we throw a crystal to the floor, it breaks, but not into haphazard pieces. It comes apart along its lines of cleavage into fragments whose boundaries, though they were invisible, were predetermined by the crystal structure. Mental patients are split and broken structures of the same kind and can reveal a number of things to us that would otherwise be inaccessible to us. 1. In his daily practice, Freud saw an extraordinary contamination, fantasy mixed with reality, discrepancies, conflicts, excessive certainties and uncertainties, symptomatic gaps, slips, blindness, resistances, denials, self-deceptions, and so on, making it impossible to draw a distinct line between delusion and truth or, for that matter, between pathological and non-pathological states. 2. Unsurprisingly, he concludes that the certainty we feel concerning the autonomy, unity, and integrity of our own ego, or subjectivity, is deceptive. 3. Not only is the ego continued inwards, without any sharp delimitation, into an unconscious mental entity which we designate as the ID and for which it serves as a kind of FACA, but it is subject to a further differentiation in the form of an internal superego to which we may attribute, among other things, delusions of observation that seem alien to the subject. 4. Further, concerning all unconscious mental activity, which extends beyond the ID to parts of the ego's own activity, for example, unconscious repression, and parts of superego activity. 46. 2. Freud notes, we have the same relation to it as we have to a psychical process in another person, except that it is in fact our own. 5. I should immediately add that Freud's notion of the unconscious undergoes a complex series of rearticulations, moving from an early conception of it as a repository to a later conception of it as a matter of active processing, which I shall not detail here. Suffice it to insist only that on its basis he contests the presupposition that we are endowed from the start with a unified cognitive faculty. 6. Moreover, although we tend to assume a clear demarcation between ourselves and the outside world, he finds this boundary to be unstable, uncertain, or inaccurately drawn. In his words, there are cases in which parts of a person's own body, even portions of his own mental life, his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, appear alien to him and as not belonging to his ego. There are other cases in which he ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in his own ego and that ought to be acknowledged by it. 7. Freud's therapeutic experience leads him, like Nietzsche, to reject the philosophical tendency to presuppose in principle a fundamental coherence in intentional life. He projects from the start a phenomenal reality in which psychopathology, extending from extreme disorders to the minor neuroses of everyday life, remains ineradicable. He finds himself obliged, therefore, to ask the transcendental question concerning the a priori conditions that underpin the persistence, despite the best of human efforts, of errance and anomaly in the genesis of a phenomenal reality. Notably, however, he does not go so far as to deny the necessity and force of coherent experience. Rather, he insists on the theoretical obligation to account for not only the coherent world constituted through productive imagination or internal time, but also the persistence of its moments of errance or anomaly. In his attempt to fulfill this obligation, he proposes a split in synthetic processing on the subjective side of the transcendental relation, but not, with Husserl, between a primary, passive genesis, neutral in effect and meaning, and a subsequent or secondary active meaning-giving genesis. Rather, with Heidegger, he takes the genesis of a phenomenal reality to be actively, albeit unconsciously, infused with meaning and effect from the start. The split he proposes, then, occurs between primary, primitive, archaic, atemporal, allergical, ahistorical, associative, hallucinatory, and therefore idiosyncratic or singular processing, beholden to the demands of the pleasure principle, and secondary, temporal, logical, successive, coherent, ordered, linguistic processing, guided by the reality principle. As Freud sees it, it is through secondary processing in intentional life that we 47 indeed build up, much as Husserl suggests, a robust phenomenal reality, although it would no longer be a perfectly coherent system if we were honest in our reality testing. In subjective development, secondary processing takes over from primary processing, subjects it to repressive measures, and tends to predominate in most adult subjects. But primary processing never falls into disuse. Instead, it operates unconsciously alongside secondary processing, often under the pressure of conflicting aims. This insistence on an ineradicable internal conflict counters what for Freud is an unwarranted prejudice in Husserlian phenomenology, which turns out to be less the privilege of pure consciousness over some notion of the unconscious as a container of contents than unjustified assumptions concerning the unity, neutrality, and rationality of our synthetic powers. 8. Pleasure and the drives. Freud, as noted above, sharply diverges from Husserl's view that we are originally perceivers and that, looking at and later reflecting upon our privileged noetic modes that make of transcendental constitution a unified seeing as, which is in principle neutral, or neutralizable, and shareable because it is rationally organized. 9. Noting that sensations are caused by both endogenous stimuli from internal organs and exogenous stimuli from the environment and that such stimuli are experienced by infants purely in terms of the pleasure-unpleasure series, Freud insists that pleasure, and, in a more complex articulation, sex and death, is not added to objects later but is the primary determinant of mental activity. 10. For us, the quest for a neutral sensory perceptual grasp of the object inscribed in the question what is it is submitted to the primacy of erotic concern, motivated, Freud emphasizes, not first by a desire for truth, but by a drive for the kind of pleasure whose telos is, paradoxically, death. 11. His introduction of the death drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle allows him to posit two kinds of drives, which express the opposing tendencies between which life is suspended and to which he gives the names eros and thanatos. 12. These drives not only oppose each other, but each is internally aporetic. In the form of eros, the preserver of life, self-preservative libido, which Freud calls narcissistic, aims to keep the peace to isolate the organism in a self-protective enclosure that would maintain its simplicity, constancy, or equilibrium, whereas the outwardly directed sexual drives, the disturbers of the peace keep traumatizing this enclosure and breaking it open to the other or the outside as he puts it, eros, by bringing about a more and more far-reaching combination of 48. The particles into which living substance is dispersed, aims at complicating life and at the same time, of course, preserving it, whereas the natos, the death drive, is less conspicuous and harder to point to. In the end we came to recognize sadism as its representative. Its task is to lead organic life back into the inanimate state. 13. The death drive, in short, involves both an inertial resistance to a change of state, which serves self-preservation, but also an entropic moment of destructiveness or dissolution, which lies at the basis of aggressivity. Freud insists that eros and thanatos form an alloy. First, both are characterized by the conservative aim to restore a state of things that was disturbed by the emergence of life. 14. The sexual drives aim for a boundary-shattering excitement that, in fact, increases tension in the organism. But they do this for the sarke of jouissance or ultimate satisfaction, and it is not for nothing that orgasm is dubbed, paradoxically, little death. Moreover, he acknowledges not only an intrinsic aggressivity or sadistic element in eros but also a vacillation in thanatos, which can either direct its destructive tendency toward the outside, in a gesture that looks a lot like self-preservation, or inward, causing the individual to become self-destructive. Given his admission that the distinction between the two classes of instincts does not seem sufficiently assured. 15. One might suggest, with Lacan, that all drives are death drives. 16. Perhaps it is as well to remind oneself here that Freud is grappling with two thoroughly paradoxical notions, without the help of the plural logic of the a priori that both Derrida and Lacan will subsequently make so much of. Ironically, in complexifying central notions, this logic also clarifies much in psychoanalytic theory. The precipitation of subjective agency, ID, ego, and superego. For Freud, then, newborn infants enter the world as a fragmentary and fragmenting play of erotic and thanatic drives. 17 From much of what he writes, one may justly assume that he views the ego, accepting with Husserl that it is a unity formally characterized by internal time, not as a podictically pregiven but as a developmental precipitate that is, moreover, only part of a conflictually articulated subjectivity. 18 Briefly outlined, he argues that subjective agency develops in our efforts to master the drives, first in the form of the ID which later diversifies not only under pragmatic pressures stemming from the external world but primarily due to the threat of castration, which precipitates the development of an ideal ego. 19 The ideal ego represents the individual's narcissistic love of itself. 49 As a unified whole distinct from but not separate from its discrete experiences. Freud names such incipient self-love infantile or primary narcissism and associates it with a childhood megalomania in which the actual ego and the ideal ego are unrealistically experienced as coinciding. Healthy individuals, he argues, undergo a further psychical diversification as a result of life's hard knocks, which detach the ideal ego from the ego. In this case, the ideal ego becomes a model not of what the ego actually is, but of what it ought to be, a superego or projected ideal unity. I should note immediately that this broad framework is beset with interpretative difficulties, including the head-spinning discrepancy concerning Freud's notion of the ego as a whole, tied to his concept of ego libido. He infers from certain disorders, such as sexual fixations on different parts of the body, that libido is grafted onto all bodily organs. 20 The trouble, however, is that he does not call this overall libidinal energy organism libido or some such term, but ego libido. This implies that there always was ego to go with libido. As if to confirm this position, he describes ego libido as narcissistic. The conjunction of ego libido and narcissism implies, contrary to the developmental account just outlined, that there is an originary ego or egoism, and that the term primary narcissism should be associated not with the formation of an ideal ego but with a primordial, oceanic state of wholeness, thought of as an encompassing allness, all is me and I am all, in relation to which the ego as a precipitated unity is merely a shrunken residue. The formation of an ideal ego, then, becomes a secondary or nostalgic narcissism. In confirmation of this, one may cite the Freud of civilization and its discontents, where he refers to an original oceanic state described as an erotic, inclusive sense of allness which he again names ego. But, as Strachey points out, in Freud's new introductory lectures, a parenthetical reference suggests that he identifies ID rather than ego in its undifferentiated primitive state with the whole person. 21 The discrepancy amounts to proposing on the one hand that we enter the world in a fragmentary state, from out of which a unity called ego is later gathered, and on the other hand that we enter the world in a state of oceanic wholeness, which is later reduced to fragments, namely ID, ego, and superego. The same discrepancy appears when Freud tries to locate the libido. According to Strachey, once he had developed the notion of ID, he insisted that the ID was the great reservoir of libido from out of which ego develops. 22 But he subsequently appears to contradict this view by locating the libido in the ego, which supports the contention that the ego is original. 2350 Perhaps such vacillation between describing the wholeness of the ego as a developmental precipitate, an achievable unity, or an encompassing allness that is lost is an effect of his attempt to do the impossible, that is, to take account of different conceptions of the whole within the bounds of an either forward/or logic that mandates a choice between them. However, in both cases the conception of the whole is impossible, because it involves an agraria, and it is philosophically more viable to begin with the paradox of their articulation, as Lacan does, using the figure of the lamella. 24 However, once the claim is made for the paradoxical status of the origin, all of Freud's central notions become shifty. Granting that Lacan's radical revisions, which exploit such discrepancies, are called for, I shall nevertheless defer further discussion of them and follow a more traditional line of interpretation here, which chooses the first, more predominant account of the ego as a developmental precipitate. The development of synthetic processing according to a traditionally favored reading of Freud's genetic account of the transcendental relation, from out of a fragmenting play of partial drives, infants strive to create a pure pleasure ego which entails both repeating pleasures and expelling pains. 25 In infancy, all subjective sensations are simply judged in terms of the pleasure-unpleasure series and are either accepted by the infant psyche as satisfying and good or rejected. For Freud, primordial infant judgment begins with oral satisfactions, expressed in the language of the oldest, the oral, instinctual impulses. The judgment is, I should like to eat this or I should like to spit it out, and, but more generally, I should like to take this into myself and to keep that out. The original pleasure ego wants to introject into itself everything that is good and to eject from itself everything that is bad. What is bad, what is alien to the ego and what is external are, to begin with, identical. 26 Somatic needs provide an inextinguishable, or only temporarily and intermittently extinguishable, source of tension, for example, hunger, which increases in severity to the extent that the needs go unsatisfied. Self-preservative somatic instincts aim to extinguish, or discharge, such painful tension, or, that is, they aim for a state of complete satisfaction. Such somatic satisfactions are, however, dependent on sources external to the individual. In infancy, they are bound up with an infant's first relation to another person, the primary caregiver or Nebenmensch. 27 Because of this, 51 Immediate protective discharge of tension, satisfaction, using internal resources alone, aggression or reflex action, such as screaming, is ineffective. 28 This dependence on external sources of satisfaction and the intrinsic inadequacy or unreliability of the source acts as a trigger for cognitive development. Importantly, Freud adds that sexual life operates alongside somatic instincts from the beginning. In his words, sexual activity attaches itself to functions serving the purpose of self-preservation and does not become independent of them until later. 29 Indeed, he notes, sucking at the mother's breast is the starting point of the whole sexual life, the unmatched prototype of every later sexual satisfaction. 30 During suckling, oral stimulation accompanies the somatic satisfaction and engenders a residual wish to repeat the pleasure, even when hunger is not urgent. This residual wish for pleasure describes the libidinal component that is grafted onto the somatic function, but libido can become independent, in the form of autoerotic gratification or self-stimulation, for example, thumb sucking. The impulse for libidinal gratification associated with the oral zone forms one component of the sex drive, which appears long before the infant is capable of constituting the discernible, robust objects that are subsequently attached to it. 31 Certain experiences soon enough demonstrate the inadequacy of an infant's primitive mode of judgment and the importance of knowing whether a source of satisfaction actually exists in the external world as something one may get hold of if necessary. The weaning process, or its equivalent, is the first of these. Cognition is not associated with the intermittent appearance and withdrawal of the breast before weaning. There is a sense of immediacy here, whereby an infant simply registers a level of uncomfortable tension and responds with automatic distress signals, which disappear upon the necessary satisfaction. Weaning acts as a trigger for psychical development whereby both somatic instincts and sexual drives diversify. In both cases, however, the process of diversification is complex and troubled. In relation to the somatic drives, which are tied to what Lacan calls the return of need, the weaning process forces infants into cognitive processing whereby they gradually learn to distinguish clearly between subjective and non-subjective. In other words, genesis of a relatively robust objective world is initiated by a first precipitous trauma caused by the infant's emerging awareness of something amiss in what was, from the infant's point of view, the closed circuit of need and satisfaction in its seamless interconnection with the Nebenmensch. As a consequence of the weaning process 52 or its equivalents, for Freud, the child becomes aware that the Nebenmensch, the single source of all possible satisfaction, also seems to instigate its perpetual loss in, for example, her always uncomfortably too abrupt withdrawal of the nourishing breast. According to Freud, this realization generates extreme anxiety. You will realize how real a situation of danger is indicated by this anxiety. If a mother is absent or has withdrawn her love from her child, it is no longer sure of the satisfaction of its needs and is perhaps exposed to the most distressing feelings of tension. 32 Simultaneously, weaning is associated with a traumatic experience of lost libidinal satisfaction and, because of the drive to reconstitute a pleasure ego, a strong demand for its restitution, through what Freud calls a secondary function whereby the satisfaction must be produced by specific, or intentional, action of some kind. Screaming itself as a primary function will not satisfy hunger, but, developed as a specific action, it might generate the appropriate response in the Nebenmensch. Further, the infant soon experiences the difference between the autoerotic oral satisfaction that can be produced at will and the satisfying breast that is withdrawn periodically and only reappears, unreliably, in response to specific actions. 33 Subjective agency develops as the seat of increasingly sophisticated specific action which nevertheless serves the same fundamental purpose, namely, to create a pure pleasure ego. Before I elaborate on Freud's complex account of the cognitive processing and subjective diversification necessary for specific action, it should be noted that the drives simultaneously undergo an equally complex diversification. Through experiences of intermittent satisfactions and frustrations, infants soon enough discover that the pleasure requirement is not easily met. As Freud puts it, the boundaries of this primitive pleasure ego cannot escape rectification through experience. 34 Suckling never was a pure pleasure, and during the weaning process, it becomes increasingly frustrating and anxiety-provoking, as incomprehensible prohibitions engender in the infant aggressive hatreds and fears, directed toward the withdrawing breast, which now compete with the earlier libidinal loves and pleasures. Eventually unable to tolerate the extreme tension associated with breastfeeding, the infant represses the breast as a sexual object. In other words, the infant psyche withdraws libidinal cathexis from the breast, shifts its sexual interest to other bodily zones, and prohibits a libidinal return to the breast, thus beginning a lengthy process of libidinal diversification. The agent responsible for this primary repression is the newly emerging ego. From the point of view of this emerging ego, the danger associated with the libidinal urge is precisely its close association with the now 53 abandoned source of somatic satisfaction and its tendency, therefore, to resurrect heavily charged hostile associations that would instigate a fresh release of dangerous unpleasure. While the repression itself generates unpleasure associated with libidinal frustration, the prohibition of discharge prevails as a primary defense against an urge that has become unbearably ambivalent. The necessary repression of the suckling impulse at what Freud calls the oral stage of psychosexual development leaves a trace, an unconscious fixation or charge of ambivalent energy around oral activity, which never leaves us. In other words, such primary repression constitutes the unconscious as a residual desire for pleasure, which persistently presses for the interdicted release. Subject to constant repressive pressure, however, it is detached from the breast and deflected onto substitute satisfactions, thumb sucking, kissing, smoking, etc. Emphasizing the force of weaning as a trigger for cognitive development and the concomitant emergence and strengthening of the ego function, Freud suggests that the most passively accepted source of somatic and libidinal satisfaction is lost through weaning just at the time, perhaps, when the child is able to form a total idea of the person to whom the organ that is giving him satisfaction belongs. 35 In other words, the traumatic loss that occurs when the infant becomes aware of a rupture in the closed circuit of the mother-child is simultaneous with, and necessary for, its power to constitute the mother as another, an object, and, accordingly, itself as an active power or agent. Notably, the anal phase that succeeds the oral as the dominant center of constellation for the drives characterizes a far more self-centered, self-sufficient, and active infant. The obvious motivation for learning to distinguish between endogenous and exogenous stimuli, that is, for constituting the transcendental relation, is self-preservation, for without this distinction it would be impossible to procure satisfactions from the external world independently. Such independence requires the power to convert drives into representations of objects, desires, that promise the appropriate satisfaction. This, in turn, requires a sophisticated synthesizing or processing system, which can bring memory traces together in order to constitute memory images, sensory images, of satisfying objects and project a course of specific action to obtain them. Moreover, the infant psyche must learn how to negotiate the unavoidable dissonance between inner and outer experience. As Wollheim notes, many drives go unsatisfied by the world, and the world is not as man's drives would have it be. 36 It must therefore learn to assess these projections and the proposed course of action in terms of relative value, and, later, ethical or social acceptability. 54 Freud explains the advance from the simple judgment of good or bad to the judgment of existence as follows. All presentations, he argues, all mental images or intentional objects, originate from perceptions, and are repetitions of them. Freud here assumes that in the immediate encounter with a thing, the very existence of the presentation is the guarantee of the reality of what is presented. In other words, the presentation has as its immediate correlative something really existing in the world. 37 Further, the psyche has the capacity for memory, understood as retention. Freud speculated that strong enough sensations flowing in from both endogenous and exogenous sources must be impressed upon the mnemic system as an accumulation of discrete fragments or traces that are retained as acquisitions. In addition, because the psyche has the capacity for memory, we can, as he puts it, bring before the mind once more something that has once been perceived, by reproducing it as a presentation without the external object having still to be there. Freud envisages the mechanism of such intentional projection as a matter of articulating discrete memory traces. In the process, we develop a highly complex network of neural connections that are initially elastic enough to be modified by additional experience or educated by repetition that batters them into shape and reinforces them. Reinforced linkages are called facilitated because once forged through habituation, they remain as permanent modifications of the system and so allow for easier processing and discharge in similar situations. However, such links, while relatively stable if they have become habitual, are never carved in stone. Notably, Lacan has criticized the translation of Barnung as facilitation because the term does not evoke the important sense of articulation or joining. 38 Taking his point, one should bear in mind that for Freud the overall task of the processing system is projective synthesis, conjoining discrete memory fragments or traces to form a mental presentation. Synthesis moves from wishes to projected mental representatives of the objects wished for and representations of the bodily movements necessary to seize them. However, projections are not always, or even often, faithful repetitions of past experiences but might be modified by omissions or distortions or newly generated by connecting memory fragments associatively to put together a fabricated object. Such projections may or may not meet the ultimate test of perceptual reality, in which they are confirmed or disconfirmed by experience. At this point, comparison with Husserl's theory of intentionality certainly suggests itself. 55 Freud, however, argues that humans are endowed with a potentially dangerous split between a primary process that is infantile and archaic in evolutionary terms and a secondary process that develops later in the path of individual maturation and is, moreover, a more recently evolved faculty. Importantly, for Freud both primary and secondary systems have their own characteristic modes of operation and remain irreducible to one another. The secondary system is not based on the primary system. Rather, it has the task of modification and control in relation to the primary system, which remains in operation alongside the newer mode and interferes with it constantly. It is in this persistent conflict between systems that Freud detects one of the weaknesses that makes our mental life so vulnerable and so accounts for the precarious state of phenomenal reality. 39 The ID and primary processing. The ID mandated by the drives to secure their discharge at all costs is the synthesizing agent responsible for primary processing, which predominates in infancy where the drives hold sway. Primary processing, however, can re-emerge in adults, where the imperious sexual or aggressive drives, which do not accept frustration gracefully, are dammed up by interdiction of their direct expression or by external obstacles. 40 These persist as powerful wishes that heighten psychical tension and press for discharge. Endeavoring to secure their discharge immediately, the ID makes use of the multiple connectivity of every trace in the overconnected network of the mnemic system in two main ways. First, as Freud argues, while neurons tend toward habitual paths of discharge, each is nevertheless capable of multiple side connections, allowing impulses to be discharged in disguised or deflected form. Even though memory traces are permanent, the use to which the processing system puts them is entirely flexible and revisable. On the one hand, therefore, primary processing fends off excessive libidinal tensions by allowing the system to find alternative paths for their immediate discharge if habitual patterns for some reason fail, practical obstacles, overload, ethical interdiction, etc. 41 This accounts for the notable plasticity of sexual impulses, or the sexualization of a diverse array of things. On the other hand, primary processing represents, paradoxically, a potentially lethal safety mechanism for if suitable outlets cannot be forged for high libidinal tensions. The ID brings the uncomfortable tensions to expression in hallucinations, that is, in projected images synthesized from sensory traces associated with high satisfaction and invested with the 56 strength and vivacity of present perceptions. As Walheim puts it, when the individual wishes sufficiently strongly, he typically cannot distinguish between the representation he makes to himself of the object of his wish and that object itself. 42 Discharge occurs, and, depending on the external circumstances, some degree of satisfaction will be achieved. But satisfaction from hallucinations, while immediate, is usually ultimately inadequate and can be dangerously pathological, particularly in adults. According to Freud, then, pathology is often explicable as a regression to primary processing, which operates entirely under the sway of the pleasure principle and without concern, therefore, for pragmatic judgments of reality, efficacy, and safety. As Freud puts it, in this connection it is easy to observe a certain indifference as to the path along which the discharge takes place, so long as it takes place somehow. 43 The ID is also indifferent to ethical judgments or, for that matter, logical judgments of consistency or contradiction. 44 But primary processing also manifests in everyday phenomena such as dreams, slips, and physical symptoms. 45 In fact, Freud argues that the most reliable evidence for its, notably prelinguistic, 46, modus operandi comes from the study of dreams. In his words, we there discovered that the processes in the unconscious systems were fundamentally different from those in the preconscious, or conscious, systems. In the unconscious, cathexes can easily be completely transferred, displaced, and condensed. 47 Further, Freud claims that in the ID there is an exception to the philosophical theorem that space and time are necessary forms of our mental acts. 48 As he explains, there is nothing in the ID that corresponds to the idea of time, there is no recognition of the passage of time, and no alteration in its mental processes is produced by the passage of time. Wishful impulses which have never passed beyond the ID, but impressions, too, which have been sunk into the ID by repression, are virtually immortal. After the passage of decades they behave as though they had just occurred. 49 By contrast, and this introduces Freud's notion of the ego function and secondary processing, Freud argues in another text that our abstract idea of time seems to be wholly derived from the method of working of the system PCPTCS, and to correspond to a perception on its own part of that method of working. 50 The ego and secondary processing to safeguard itself, the psychic apparatus must take on a more complex mode of operation, which projects not merely the sensory experience of 57 the satisfying object but also the ordered connection of actions and circumstances that must be repeated to secure it. It is the task of the newly emerging ego, then, to intersperse between drive and action the delay of practical thinking or reality testing which is still motivated by the aim of gaining satisfaction but requires a postponement of pleasure for the psyche of a more robust sense of the external world. Naming the ego that portion of the ID which was modified by the proximity and influence of the external world, which is adapted for the reception of stimuli and as a protective shield against stimuli. 51 Freud argues that it has a dual purpose. Facing inward, it develops from perceiving the instincts to controlling them by inhibiting the strong flows of libidinal energy that precipitate hallucinations. Fortunately, for the ID cannot foresee the dangers of its blind efforts to satisfy the drives. 52 As Freud notes, the ego must on the whole carry out its intentions. It fulfills its task by finding out the circumstances in which those intentions can best be achieved. The ego's relation to the ID might be compared with that of the rider to his horse. The horse supplies the locomotive energy, while the rider has the privilege of deciding on the goal and of guiding the powerful animal's movement. But only too often there arises between the ego and the ID the not precisely ideal situation of the rider being obliged to guide the horse along the path by which it itself wants to go. 53 To address this task, the ego, facing outward, must construct an accurate picture of the external world, against which, in a process he calls reality testing, it can pass judgment on projected psychical presentations, distinguishing between representations derived from reality and the representatives of the drives. 54 In contrast to its indifference with regard to objects, then, the ego is characteristically more particular about the choice of both an object and of a path of discharge. 55 The ego, as Freud puts it, must be capable of allotting to the object of the drive, the projected desire that stands as a psychical representative of the drive, its proper place in a considerable assemblage, by its being taken up into a coherent context. 56 Implicitly, then, the hallucinatory primary process, driven by the pleasure principle, disturbs our sense of reality only if the ego is not strong enough to control it. Importantly, reality testing for Freud is seemingly based on a clear distinction between what is unreal, a merely subjective presentation whose source is internal, and what is real which is also there outside. 57 Freud describes it as a form of judgment in which it is a matter of 58 discovering whether something which is in the ego as a presentation can be rediscovered in perception, reality, as well. In other words, as he notes, it is evident that a precondition for the setting up of reality testing is that objects shall have been lost which once brought real satisfaction again. The first and immediate aim, therefore, of reality testing is, not to find an object in real perception which corresponds to the one presented, but to refine such an object, to convince oneself that it is still there. 58 In contrast with the primary process, which works by a temporal free association, the secondary process, for Freud, works according to modes of ordered causality, that is, according to the unified temporality that Husserl envisaged, and the rational association of ideas. Linking time and thought, Freud characterizes the ego, in contrast to the ID, in terms of an intrinsic tendency toward unity. 59 However, primary processing does not disappear upon the development of secondary processing and, as Walheim notes, there are areas of life over which the writ of the reality principle never runs. 60 In short, Freud acknowledges that rational association is but one type in a much broader range of associative logics, visual puns, homophonies, morphological similarities, etc., all of which have a sense, albeit not the sense of logical connections. Admittedly, there is plenty of evidence that Freud privileges the rational association of the secondary process, notably in the claim that in healthy adults the reality principle dethrones the pleasure principle. 61 However, the ego is not entirely identifiable with a neutral transcendental synthesis. In addition to its function of consciously directing attention to external and internal stimuli in reality testing, it also has an unconscious function, namely to resist, ignore, suppress, filter, divert, interdict, the conscious expression of repressed materials. One might suggest that the ego as a conscious psychical function or synthetic operator gradually develops its power under pragmatic pressures, whereas its unconscious function, including an emergent self-awareness, or its sense of itself as a whole, develops in relation to its libidinal attachments, and it is this unconscious function, as Lacan argues, that pulls the carpet from under the feet of what has so far appeared to conform to an realism. Lacan, indeed, will eventually subject Freud's entire analysis of reality to revision, for Freud has already, perhaps without explicitly acknowledging it, offered the means to see something beyond the claim that primary processing tends to trip the subject up by interfering with the coherence supposedly offered by honest reality testing. Based on an alternative understanding of reality as essentially in flux, Lacan shows that the pleasure principle tends toward hallucinating a stabilizing fiction. Honest 59 reality testing of such fictions would not yield absolute repeatability but at best iterability, which means in consequence that an absolutely secure reality is refound only at the cost of repressive measures. This account, incidentally, promises to explain why an otherwise thorough and perspicacious thinker like Husserl tends systematically to repress what is radically subversive in his thinking, allowing himself the comfort of self-deception, rather than exposing his security-desiring self to the anxiety of open and honest confrontation with the implications of his own thinking. 62 The question of language concerning the problem of the microarticulation between word and thought. Freud argues that our capacity to have and use ideas, to make sense, or to think about something is an essentially complex phenomenon consisting in the articulation of two combinations of auditory, visual, kinesthetic, and other mnemic residues to form mental presentations, one of which, based on primary processing, is open-ended, the thing presentation, while the other, based on secondary processing, is closed and rational, the word presentation. 63 According to Wollheim, Freud now asserted, first, that thing presentations cannot become conscious until they have become linked with residues from perceptions of words, and, secondly, that the word presentations belong to the preconscious, not to the unconscious. Indeed, they are one of the prime agents in giving that stability and cohesiveness to our mental life which characteristically differentiates the secondary from the primary process. 64 In other words, reflecting the Nietzschean movement of metaphorical transfer between spheres. For Freud, a thing presentation first becomes preconscious through becoming connected with the word presentations corresponding to it. 65 Recalling that consciousness, for Freud, is a form of perception, he adds that once the links have been formed, the idea will thereby have attracted to itself sufficient sensory quality to become the object of an internal perception. Thus, it is through the translating interposition of word presentations that internal thought processes are made into perception. 66 Like Nietzsche, then, Freud challenges Husserl's requirement that language remain essentially uninvolved in conscious thinking, which relegates it to the secondary role of communication and preservation. One can see in this association between thing presentations, signifies, and 60 word presentations, signifiers, the precursor to Saussures' insistence that ready-made ideas do not exist in consciousness before words and that language, therefore, is merely a self-contained system of material marks that represents or doubles a purely cognitively constituted phenomenal world. 67 Saussure grants that at whatever level it operates, signification is always the association of two terms, namely the indicative or signifying term, the signifier, the mark, sound, signal, symbol, or word, and the indicated or signified term, the thing, referent, concept, idea, meaning, sense. However, on his account of the signifying process, he insists upon the inescapable unity of signifier and signified in the sign. There is never a sign in the absence of this unity. In his words, I call the combination of a concept, signified, and a sound image, signifier, a sign, but in current usage the term generally designates only a sound image, a word, for example, arbor, etc. One tends to forget that arbor is called a sign only because it carries the concept tree with the result that the idea of the sensory part, the signifier, implies the idea of the whole. 68 Accordingly, this association of terms cannot simply be a matter of supplying a material marker for a pre-existing meaning. Rather, the meaning is constituted in the act of association. Based on further Saussurean insights, however, both Derrida and Lacan challenge in turn Freud's conception of language. There is nevertheless something radically innovative in his insistence that language is not a subsequently appropriated, ideally transparent, and univocal vehicle for the mere transmission of thought, but that it is implicated directly and originally in mental processing. Libidinal vicissitudes as experience fills the mnemic system with traces and the ego's power for secondary processing slowly gains the upper hand over the primary processing in the ID. The drives simultaneously undergo a process of differentiation. Libido remains dominated by the ID in the anal and phallic phases that follow the oral, and, under the influence of the unmodified pleasure principle, infants form new erotic attachments and autoerotic satisfactions, which again, due to necessary repression, leave residual fixation points. Here, then, the play of partial drives produce in an infant, as Coppi puts it, a dispersed body and polymorphous and perverse pleasure. 69 Constituted in terms of autoerotic attachments to parts of the infant's own body, mouth, anus, genitals, and other openings onto the external world through which the drives circulate. The ego's sense of itself as a whole is not robust. 70-61 In an erotic attachment Freud names the Oedipus complex. The first person to become a love object is the Nebenmensch, the primary caregiver and protector, who is predominantly the mother. 71 This first love relation, however, is doomed to dissolution, but not primarily because of the immoderate character of infantile demands for nourishment and love, the impossibility of fulfilling childish sexual wishes, and the ambivalence of a child's attachment to the parents. All this, Freud argues, is insufficient to dissolve the Oedipus complex, and what does the trick in the end is the castration complex, the castration threat in boys and its equivalent in girls, namely that girls hold their mother responsible for their lack of a penis and do not forgive her for their being thus put at a disadvantage. 72 According to Freud, the threat need not be explicit. Rather, it is an experienced fear of castration, equivalent to a feared loss of love, which is evidently a later prolongation of the infant's anxiety if it finds its mother absent. 73 Under the pressure of this threat, a child is forced to abandon its Oedipus complex, so renouncing the intense libidinal investment, or object cathexis, it has placed in its parents. 74 The castration threat, then, constitutes the first great parental betrayal, and it initiates the lengthy metamorphosis of the parental relationship into the superego. 75 Two dramatic, correlative changes occur. First, an ideal ego is formed through identification, and second, the ideal is libidinally cathected through sublimation, whose consequence is narcissism. On the basis of the argument that if one has lost an object or has been obliged to give it up, one often compensates oneself by identifying oneself with it and by setting it up once more in one's ego. Freud claims that when the Nebenmensch withdraws as a love object and becomes a threatening figure, the ego, in a self-protective and compensatory gesture, identifies itself with the lost love and forms itself on the model of the lost Nebenmensch. 76 He defines identification as the assimilation of one ego to another one, as a result of which the first ego behaves like the second in certain respects, imitates it and in a sense takes it up into itself. 77 In contrast to object choice, then, which retains some distance between ego and the object it would like to have, identification imitates or assimilates the object that the ego wants to be like and, for this reason, alters the ego. 78 Thus altered, the ego presents itself to the ID in a bid, notably, for success is not guaranteed, to get the ID to love the simulacrum, the ideal ego, in place of the Nebenmensch. Importantly, Freud notes that the construction of an ideal ego should not be confused with the sublimation of an instinct. 79 In his understanding, such sublimation would be the equivalent of some success in the ego's bid. Success here means that the 62 child's libido is detached from the dispersed body parts that serve as attachment points to the Nebenmensch, and the quota of libido released thereby is internalized and concentrated upon the newly formed ideal ego. The consequence of this libidinal displacement is the condition of narcissism, which involves a sense of the ego as a whole, or self-awareness. Notably, narcissism denotes not love for the ego as an object, but as a whole, which Freud tends to think of as a unity neither separate from, nor identical to, the sum total of my experiences. Further, Freud argues, we are bound to suppose that a unity comparable to the ego cannot exist in the individual from the start. The ego has to be developed. The autoerotic instincts, however, are there from the very first, so there must be something added to autoerotism, a new psychical action, in order to bring about narcissism. 80 He does not name this new psychical action here, but, given that narcissism is described as the consequence of the internalization of the quota of libido released from object cathexis and concentrated on the ego, it evidently enough refers to sublimation. This is confirmed later in the text, where sublimation is described as the transformation of sexual object libido into narcissistic libido. 81 Further, he argues that childhood megalomania points the way to an account of this action of sublimation, for such megalomania comes into being at the expense of object libido. 82 Since excess libidinal energy, liberated by its withdrawal from the external object, by the frustration or prohibition of sexual interest in the mother, must go somewhere, it is redirected back into the ego libido and initially stored up in the ego. 83 Freud refers to such sublimated libido as desexualized. 84 Henceforth, the ego never relinquishes control over the deflected, desexualized quota of libido. To this extent, for the rest of its life, the ego becomes the great reservoir from which libidinal cathexes are sent out to objects and into which they are once more withdrawn, just as an amoeba behaves with its pseudopodia. To tie this development back to the earlier discussion of secondary processing, Freud notes, if this displaceable energy is desexualized libido, it may also be described as sublimated energy, for it would still retain the main purpose of eros, that of uniting and binding, insofar as it helps towards establishing the unity, or tendency to unity, which is particularly characteristic of the ego. If thought processes in the wider sense are to be included among these displacements, then the activity of thinking is also supplied from the sublimation of erotic motive forces. 85-63 Having taken up the deflected libido, the now self-aware ego initially invests all of it in self-love, megalomania. Narcissistic libido is at first entirely invested in a magnificent, all-powerful, superhuman, ideal ego modeled on the parents, which a child identifies with its actual ego. But the gesture soon becomes ambivalent because the child experiences real-world limitations, whereas the ideal ego remains fixed in the unconscious, and a gap gradually opens up between the ideal ego and the ego. 86 First, as Freud notes, when the child renounces its Oedipus complex and forms the ideal ego, the parental figures are quite magnificent, but they subsequently lose much of this initial grandeur. The ego certainly also identifies with these diminished parental figures, but, he argues, these later identifications only affect the ego and not the ideal ego, which has been determined by the earliest parental images. 87 Moreover, the child also experiences its own actual limitations, which, again, affect the ego but not the ideal ego. However, as Freud notes, humans are incapable of giving up a libidinal satisfaction once enjoyed. We prove to be unwilling to give up on the narcissistic perfection of childhood. Thus, as adults, disturbed by the admonitions of others and our own emerging power of self-criticism, to the point that we can no longer retain that perfection, we seek to recover it in the new form of an ego ideal. Thus we now project a substitute ideal for the lost narcissism, wholeness, perfection, of childhood, in which each was her/his own ideal. 88 Experience, then, is the source of the further development whereby the ego diversifies, forming within itself the new form of an ego ideal, namely an idealized superego. Freud sums up and condenses the lineaments of this new development in a later passage. The development of the ego consists in a departure from primary narcissism and gives rise to a vigorous attempt to recover that state. This departure is brought about by means of the displacement of libido onto an ego ideal imposed from without, and satisfaction is brought about from fulfilling this ideal. 89 To elaborate, the ideal ego is now raised above the actual ego to form a superego and reflects not what I imagine I am but what I believe I should be. In this sense, the new form of an ego ideal, the superego, is imposed from without. Further, Freud argues that the superego operates as the vehicle of cultural reproduction over the generations, for a child's superego is in fact constructed on the model not of its parents but of its parents' superego. 90 Notably, then, cultural reproduction, for Freud, is not a secondary acquisition but is inscribed in the psyche as part of its constitution. In his words, mankind never lives entirely in the present. 64 The past, the tradition of the race and of the people, lives on in the ideologies of the superego, and yields only slowly to the influences of the present and to new changes, and so long as it, the past, operates through the superego it plays a powerful part in human life, independently of economic conditions. 91 A libidinal shift occurs when the narcissism of childhood megalomania, which loves the actual ego as identical to the ideal ego, is displaced onto this new form of the ideal ego, which makes of it an acknowledged ideal to be sought after. 92 I prefer the term superego for this new form, simply because it avoids the incessant irritation of dyslexic confusion with the ideal ego and the ego ideal. Narcissistic or internally directed libido, then, shifts from megalomania, I love what I am, what I was, to hero worship, I love what I'd like to be. 93 Love of this superego goes hand in hand with negative criticism directed toward the ego. 94 Such criticism is negative, rather than a matter of realistic self-appraisal, because the superego represents an idealization the ego can never match. 95 According to Freud, the ego strives to recover its state of primary narcissism, where ego and ideal ego are matched, and satisfaction, self-esteem, derives in part from its degree of success in this direction. As a child's critical faculty matures, this overvaluation of the ego that underpins both megalomania and self-criticism is, in the best of all possible worlds, gradually rectified. Some form of compromise between the two, in realistic self-appraisal, may be attributed to the dampening down effect of an increased capacity for reality testing. However, Freud finds the primary mitigating force in the resurgence of sexual libido at puberty. Hitherto predominantly dispersed over partial drives and autoerotic satisfactions, the sex drive, under the pressure of a new aim, reproduction, gathers together under a dominant genital organization and directs itself altruistically toward a potential life partner. 96 Accordingly, besides the narcissistic choice of love object, marking internally directed libido, or ego libido, an analytic choice reemerges, marking externally directed libido or object libido. Notably, as Bruce Fink points out, these remarks have inspired generations of analysts to assume that successfully reaching the genital stage represents a departure from the narcissism and selfishness of oral and anal relations in the name of a harmonious state in which one takes one's sexual partner as a subject, not an object, as a Kantian end in himself or herself, not as a means to an end. By contrast with autoerotic satisfactions, it is in genital relations, which supposedly reflect a harmony between the sexes, that one becomes truly altruistic, that is, capable of doing things for another person without any thought of the advantages it may bring to oneself. 97-65 To return to Freud, ego libido and object libido are interchangeable by inverse proportion. It is necessary to withdraw libidinal energy from the one to give more to the other. 98 The choice for one or the other is differently motivated. Ego libido provides independent satisfaction, via sublimation, that is reliable but rarely sufficient. Its extreme, in almost total internalization of libido, marks a reversion to infantile narcissism and megalomania that shows up in certain disorders. 99 Object libido provides high satisfaction, but since it is derived from an external source, it is unreliable. With the reemergence of object libido at puberty, Freud can now argue that the ego as self-aware remains at a reflective distance from the superego and can take on the role of distributing libido in inverse proportion between narcissistic edification and the outward path of the sex drive. Sublimation becomes a matter of removing libido from these newfound sexual objects and turning it inward onto the superego, allowing the subject to take non-sexual, narcissistic pleasure in ensuring that the ego matches the superego. Sexual love for objects, tied to crude body pleasures, is supposedly converted by sublimation into self-regard or self-esteem, which is the consequence of taking a more refined pleasure in edification such that the subject may become an exemplary representative of a particular culture or group, and, in this capacity, an ethical being. With the resurgence of object libido, then, comes a fresh wave of repression or censorship, which proceeds from the self-respect of the ego 100 even if the desired object and the projected means to achieve it are practically viable. What now intrudes is the culturally acquired question, arising with the formation of the superego, of their social and ethical acceptability. The repressed libidinal impulses that arise from fixation points in the erotogenic zones, and their derivatives, persist in the ID unchanged and continually press for satisfaction. From the point of view of the developed and differentiated ego, the expression of these impulses arouses unpleasurable feelings. Not only do they come to be seen as perverse, but they also conjure up one of the infantile situations of extreme danger, helplessness in early immaturity, loss of love, fear of castration. 101 They therefore provoke repressive opposition from the ego, whose aim is always to eradicate unpleasure. 102 According to Freud, the ego succeeds in this task if it is strong and has drawn the instinctual impulse concerned into its organization. In this case, the perverse impulse may be totally destroyed and the libido permanently diverted along other paths, as occurs in the normally resolved Oedipus complex. In non-pathological development, these urges find paths to discharge through derivatives. If these derivatives have become sufficiently far removed from the repressed 66 representative, whether owing to the adoption of distortions or by reason of the number of intermediate links inserted, they have free access to the conscious 103 in the case of repression. However, the ego is conflicted, it is unable to resist the pressure of interdicted libidinal urges but cannot tolerate the pain that floods in upon their satisfaction. To deal with this conflict, it severs ideas from their effect and subjects ideas to repression. 104 Effect, then, is inhibited, attached to another idea, or transformed into anxiety. Several responses to such anxiety are possible, which Freud associates with varying degrees of pathology. An anxiety attack can be fully generated and the ego withdraws entirely from the objectionable excitation. 105 Block libido may regress to one of the earlier libidinal fixation points, preserved in the ID, combining forces to form symptoms, via primary processing. In what Freud names the return of the repressed which marks the failure of repression, this complex of forces is taken up into the ego in various ways, as reaction formations, as the intensification of certain dispositions, as a permanent alteration of the ego, and if it is excessively strong, all manner of compulsions and pathologies can gravitate around it, such as the myriad eating disorders that persist despite all we know via nutritional science. 106 For Freud, finally, the sex drive becomes the source of resistance to cultural edification, and sexual liberation provides the antidote to the excessive repressions and oppressions demanded by the process of civilization. This argument, however, binds humanity into an impossible choice between the mutually exclusive demands of sex and civilization, or, in equivalent terms, between pathological urges and the will, or again, between happiness and ethics. Hence, Freud's notorious pessimism concerning the endemic discontent associated with civilization. Concluding remarks I think it is fair to say, in conclusion, that Freud presents multiple enigmas on both sides of the transcendental relation. On the side of the subject, his most radical innovation is to insist that nothing comes to consciousness in the absence of language. However, on the one hand, he divides preconscious and unconscious processing on the basis of a difference in mode of articulation between the non-rational, open-ended, image-based primary process responsible for thing presentations and the closed, unified, rationally ordered, language-based secondary process responsible for word presentations. On the other hand, Lacan and Derrida find plenty of evidence in Freud's texts, particularly the interpretation 67 of dreams, to show that words can be as much things as images and have irrational affinities that allow them to enter into associative relations of condensation and displacement, characteristic for Freud of the primary process, just as easily as images. In fact, Lacan argues, condensation and displacement are synonymous with metonymy and metaphor. In short, having made a distinction between unconscious and preconscious processing, Freud also blurs it in a way that subsumes both thing and word presentations under the broader banner of signification in general. 107 This blurring has two important reciprocal implications. First, if signifying practice is the broader category to which language belongs as one example of associative processing, it can no longer be characterized as a closed system. Second, for Lacan, this implies that what is called the unconscious, namely primary processing, is structured like a language instead of making a distinction between unconscious and conscious processing. Then, Lacan prefers Saussures' distinction between two fundamental principles of association. 108 The principle of arbitrariness dominates the in-tre-sign, paradigmatic associations among and between signifiers and signifieds. A concept can be linked to any succession of sounds, as demonstrated by the multiplicity of associated signifiers in different languages. This associative link, then, has no rational basis, for there is no reason for preferring one such succession to another. The principle of linearity dominates the syntagmatic associations. The signifying elements, for example, letters, words, phrases, and sentences in a written text, are presented in linear succession. They form a chain whereby signs take on and change significance as a result of different oppositions to what precedes and what follows. 109 Importantly, then, meaningful terms arise and are maintained as the effect of an articulated, joined, network of differential interrelationships. Here, meaning becomes a function of arbitrary paradigmatic associations between signifiers and signifieds, combined with the place a sign occupies relative to others in a chain. Moreover, whatever the forces of change are, whether they are phonetic changes undergone by the signifier, or perhaps changes in meaning which affect the signified concept, and whether they occur in isolation or in combination, they always result in a shift in the relationship between the signified and the signifier. It is this shift in relationship that constitutes an altered signification. 110 To say, in sum, that meaning is constituted diacritically is to say that it is constituted by the relations of difference that operate both at the paradigmatic, metaphoric, vertical level of the code, of that which stands in the place of another, as well as at the syntagmatic, material, horizontal level of articulation or joining. 68 According to Lacan, one could argue that all synthetic processing is in principle accessible to analytic unraveling and interpretation, albeit with some effort, since synthetic articulations are not always logical or rational but associative, metaphorical, or metonymic. What is properly unconscious and therefore entirely inaccessible to interpretation or analysis makes itself felt not in any synthesizing or interpretative processes but in what Freud calls die not des Lebens, which should be read not as life's needs but as something infinitely stronger, something that wishes. 111 When one turns to the question of what causes such wishing in the first place, one uncovers questions, enigmas, and aparias on the material side of the transcendental relation, associated with Freud's treatment of the notion of the real and repetition. On the one hand, Freud goes no further than Husserl's inductive assumption of repeatability, without guarantee of absolute repetition. On the other, he proposes a theory of the real as trauma, which is intrinsically incompatible with any form of the metaphysics of presence. Taking up and elaborating on Freud's account of trauma, Lacan launches not only a critique of all consciousness philosophy derived from the cogito but also of the ego psychology that is compatible with it. Ego psychologists take to heart one of Freud's conceptions of the analytic task, namely that the therapeutic intention of psychoanalysis is, indeed, to strengthen the ego, to make it more independent of the superego, to widen its field of perception and enlarge its organization, so that it can appropriate fresh portions of the ID. Where ID was, their ego shall be. It is a work of culture, not unlike the draining of the Zuda Z112 on the supposition that knowing the truth frees us from its unconscious effects. The aim of ego psychology is to cut through symptomatic disguises and the protective defenses and resistances that hold them in place, in order to help analyzers recognize the supposedly true traumatic events that lie behind them and interpret the vicissitudes of such traumas in their narratives. What Lacan objects to in this approach is a marked philosophical novet concerning truth and reality, in opposition to which he aims to save what is radically enigmatic in Freud's formulation of trauma. His aim is to rescue psychoanalytic theory from domestication by an ego psychology that Freud sometimes endorses but that undoes his most valuable insights in its subjection to the metaphysics of presence. Lacan demonstrates instead that instabilities in Freud's theory of constitution already render impossible such a theory of proper recollective, analytical reflection. For Freud has already made such a theory enigmatic by an auto-deconstructing double that acknowledges the abyssal nature of analysis, which does not get down to a hard kernel of truth, the true 69 reality behind the symptomatic disguises, but the hard kernel of the real which paradoxically remains a traumatic tear, or navel or a swarming void around which the fabrication of sense or the constitution of phenomenal reality ceaselessly turns. But here, Freud acknowledges that analysis may function not to strengthen the ego but to aid the subject's self-invention. One of the ways in which quasi-transcendental thinking emerges, then, is in the recognition that Freud's thinking, poised on the threshold between the metaphysics of presence and its ruin but without the Derridian or Lacanian means to negotiate it, via the plural logic of the agraria, renders every fundamental concept enigmatic by drawing together incompatible economic and aneconomic formulations. As I shall explicate more fully in the further course of this study, despite all of the acknowledged innovative genius of Freud's account of the transcendental relation, it is in Lacan's revision that a move to quasi-transcendental thinking in psychoanalytic theory becomes explicit. In general terms, although there is nothing on the material side of the transcendental relation, Freud inadvertently shows that there is no determinable ground for insisting upon its repeatability. Again, on the grounds of the generalized theory of signification, which Lacan draws from Freud's practice, it can be demonstrated that there are no stabilizing grounds on the subjective side of the relation either, because signification cannot ever become a closed system. Ultimately, the transcendental relation is characterized by open-endedness on both sides. As an effect of such open-endedness, everything constituted is made possible by our capacity to wrest it out of its open-endedness and artificially stabilize it. But because it has been artificially constituted, its very possibility is always under threat, making anything essential, absolute, final, perfect, or incorruptible strictly impossible. When something is made possible, it is also strictly speaking made impossible. Lacan, as I will discuss in chapter 7, turns to what he calls the touch for an understanding of what causes the aporetic trouble in the transcendental relation, whereby the desire for pleasure causes us to economize in the automaton rather than face the truth. Derrida calls this same cause of all the trouble difference. But this is where Derrida's own troubles start, because difference has been so thoroughly misconstrued as a figure of free play in what follows. I aim to demonstrate instead that Derrida's texts are never a matter of free play but are, in one way or another, the performance of the inescapable agorias engendered by the necessity of operating within a philosophical discourse that speaks of the conditioned and its conditions while faced with the 70 impossibility of these conditions ever being proper. He insists that there are good reasons for acknowledging and working with this necessary impropriety within transcendental discourse, and, therefore, for why his work must be thought of neither as transcendental thinking nor as being entirely in opposition to it, but as answering to the demands of a logic that is somewhere, that is, nowhere, in between, which is marked by prefixing the transcendental with the quasi that ruins it. To support the argument that the plural logic of the agraria that disorders all of Derrida's writings, including those on the Freudian text, can help make sense of Lacan's return to Freud, which is not a return but inventive repetition, it is first necessary to counter the still widespread prejudice that reduces Derrida's quasi-transcendental thinking to only one of its sides, namely, a free play of differences. It is to this task that I shall now turn.